gentlemen. Our speaker this afternoon is Professor Morris Halle, an institute professor who has been associated with linguistics, now linguistics and philosophy, and with RLE. He joined RLE, as I did when Jerry Wiesner was directing it, 1951. I've known Morris since somewhat before that, but over all of the years, I think my favorite quotation came from when he received the Killian Award and talked about how he had become a linguist and said that in his childhood in Latvia, he grew up in a household in which all the adults spoke different language. Every adult had a different language. And he knew, he induced, being an intelligent fellow, he induced from his surroundings, that when you grew up, you got your own language. And indeed it happened, but he never guessed that his was going to be English. He's going to talk to us on the representation of words in memory.
You need a handout. Anybody here? You can't follow this without this speech without a handout. Oh, damn it. Where's now? Yeah, that's better. The light is so strong here. In speaking, as well as in listening to speech of others, we have the very clear and distinct impression that all utterances are composed of discrete words. Many people are quite surprised when it's pointed out to them that utterances are quasi-continuous acoustically and normally contain no pauses separating one word from the next. And this impression of speaking and hearing discrete words in the continuous speech signal is not lost even by the most experienced speech researchers who are completely aware that utterances are not acoustically segmented into words. Now, there's more to it. When I produce the English utterance, a dog never plays when he's alone, everyone in this room can not only repeat it, but when asked, can easily establish that the utterances consisted of 8 words. A dog never plays when he is alone. On the other hand, when I produce the utterance pesi nikti nehrayeg dishesam, everyone in this room, most people in this audience will have difficulty in repeating what I said. And we'll find it almost impossible to determine how many words this utterance was composed of. Yet you heard it just as clearly as the other utterance I made. Well, there's of course no mystery about the result of this little experiment. The second utterance was in Czech, a language that I suppose not many people in this room command. And since they did not know Czech, they couldn't. They didn't know since they don't know Czech, they don't know the words of Czech, and knowledge of a language is, of course, crucial to all aspects of speech. Our experiment also brings out the fact that an essential aspect of the knowledge of language is the knowledge of words. Now, most people think that that's all. but it's not true. But I will not enlighten you on that topic. I will perhaps reinforce the incorrect impression that many of you may have that knowing the words is all. It's a large part of what you have to do, but it isn't all. Now, this totally unsurprising proposition, however, has a number of corollaries that provide helpful hints about the nature of language. Perhaps the most important of these for our topic is that we are not born knowing the words of our language. The words we know we've learned from our parents, from other people, from books or other media. So what does it mean to know a word? When we learn or come to know a word, we store in our memory information of a certain kind that enables us to use the word in utterances that we ourselves produce and to recognize it when used in an utterance by someone else. The information that we need in order to do this is of two kinds. On the one hand, we need information about the sound of the word. Let us call this the phonetic information. On the other hand, we need information about the meaning of the word, about its lexical category. For example, we need to know, is it a noun or a verb or an adjective? Its grammatical peculiarities. For example, is it a strong or a weak verb? Does it form its plural with a regular S, as in cakes or keys, or with an N, as in children and oxen? And let's call the latter information grammatico-semantic information. Now, the present talk will be limited to the phonetic information. I shall have nothing to say, next to nothing to say about the other kind, though if anybody wants to talk about it, I'm happy to answer questions about it. Okay, so now we know that we must store in our memory, the phonetic information about every word. Now, that is, we're not born knowing it, and if you want to say dog or cat or table or whatever you happen to want to say, something has to be in your memory to say it. You don't say it. We very rarely make up words. For all practical purposes, we can say we never make up words. We always get them from the outside. Now, this naturally leads to the question as to the form in which this memory is stored, in the form in which this information is stored in our memory. It has been assumed by most linguists and other students of language that the phonetic information about each word is stored as a sequence of discrete units called phonemes. As a first approximation, we may think of the phonemes as the units that are represented by the letters in written language. Thus, the claim that is being made here is that speakers of English remember the word cat as being composed of 3 phonemes, whereas the word scat is a sequence of 4 phonemes, etc., etc. Now, if we reflect on it a bit, the proposition that words are composed of phonemes is anything but self-evident. It implies that all speakers of all languages store the words they know as sequences of discrete letter-size units. Perhaps the most dubious implication of this proposition is that this must be true also of very young children, say 3 years and younger, for many of them speak quite fluently. If our claim is correct, they must be able not only to split up into discrete words the continuous speech that they hear, but they must also be able to segment the words into phonemes. Such children must therefore be able to perform sophisticated analyses on the utterances they hear that are beyond the present-day capabilities of speech science. Even worse, is that there's nothing out there in the world that might suggest to a 2-year-old, or to anyone for that matter, that speech consists of words and that words are composed of phonemes. And, this discovery that words are composed of phonemes underlies alphabetic writing. And alphabetic writing wasn't discovered till, 3,000 years ago, but human beings have been around and probably been speaking for, God knows, maybe 1 million years. We don't, but anyway, it's a relatively recent discovery that sort of as a conscious discovery. Yet, as an unconscious discovery, if this claim is true, it must underlie all language at all times. Now, and this is rather surprising and not far from self-evident. So, but how come that somebody learns it since, you know, your mother never tells you to study the phonemes of your language, and certainly mothers, maybe now, you know, recently they've become more anxious about their children getting into kindergarten. But, you know, even when I was a child, people didn't worry too much about it. So the question is, how come that children even begin to get the idea that they have to do that? Well, when you are asked, when you are faced with unanswerable questions, the obvious move, there is one standard move that every professor, I mean, everybody knows, and that is to question the presuppositions. So instead of answering the question, we'll say, well, what's the presupposition of this question? And maybe we can then get on. Now, implicitly in this question and objection is the assumption that children need to learn both that there are words and that words are composed of phonemes. Instead, we might assume something different. And here we follow a line of reasoning that, like lots of what goes on here, was pioneered by Chomsky originally, and namely that this knowledge is hardwired into all of us at birth, and that the knowledge that speech is composed of phonemes is as much part of our physiological makeup as our heart or lungs and liver. Our language has a word for such innate knowledge, and that's the word instinct. And here I quote from the Webster's Third, and it said that an instinct is a complex and specific response on the part of an organism to environmental stimuli that is largely hereditary and unalterable, though the pattern of behaviors through which it is expressed may be modified by learning. That does not involve reason, a learning that does not involve reason, and that has as its goal the removal of attention or excitation. Well, I mean, if you have the instinct for chopping words into phonemes, well, then you do them, and there's nothing to explain. That's the only way you can be, because that's what it means to be, at least in part, be human and have the capacity to learn language. So children now, if this assumption is correct, learn words not because they're taught to do so, but rather because they're constructed from birth so as to do this, and part of their innate machinery consists of the mechanisms that analyze words into its phonemes. And of course, we do not know very much about these mechanisms, but that's the logic of the situation. Now, there's even some very simple experimental evidence showing that very young English-speaking children analyze their words into phonemes. The evidence involves the ability of children to form plurals of nouns they know. So in English, the plurals are formed, as you all know, by adding s. Well, that's not quite correct. If you look at the examples in 2, you will see that it differs somewhat. So it's very clear if you look in, let's say, in 2c, that you don't add just s. You add beach, the word beach, and the plural of that is not beaches, but it's beaches. You add a whole syllable. And if you look in 2b, you don't add s, which is, right? But you add, notice you don't say keys. You don't say place. You say keys, plays, which is, so you add z there. And finally, in fact, you do add s just in the case of the examples in 2a. All right? So notice that there are 3 distinct plurals, not just one. Those of you who came in late better sit next to somebody who has a handout. I don't have any more, because you can't follow this without the Okay. All right, so there's 3 suffixes. And you know, the children have to know which to say. For example, if a child says keys, you'll notice that there's something wrong with the way the child speaks, and mom might get anxious. But children never do that. They always do. They never say, or if a child were to say cakus, instead of cakes. You would notice that. And children never do. They know how to say it correctly. Now, in fact, it turns out that, that these plural suffixes are not randomly distributed. You don't have to learn each word with its plural, but there is a general rule. And the rule is given in one form of the rule. We'll be talking about this rule. Is given in 3. Now, what it says there, if the noun ends in ch, j, s, sh, j, then the plural is us. Okay, that's the first part of the rule. Second part, otherwise, if it doesn't end in this list, then if it ends in k, p, t, f, th, then add s. And finally, otherwise adds. So you have like a decision tree. You check a list, and you understand how to do it. Okay? Now, okay, so this is the rule. Now the question is, do children know this rule? Or is this something that clever linguists invented, people who get PhDs from MIT? Well, the answer is that children know this rule. And in fact, in the literature, there's an experiment that shows it. And that experiment is rather, I'll tell you, it's a rather simple experiment. The experimenters had different kind of dolls, and they gave them names. So one doll had the name was a Cly, and another doll was a Klish, let's say, and another doll was, his name was Plick. And now obviously these are not English words. The children had never heard these words. The experimenters never, so they introduced these dolls to the children, and then they ran the experiment. And they were very careful never to use plurals of these names. And then they arranged them in little groups in this room where the test was conducted. The children were brought in, and the child was asked, "What's that?" Pointing at a group of dolls of one type. And the child would say, "These are Clys," or "These are," what was it? Whatever it was, I couldn't pass that test anyway, but they were, so I'm too old for that. But anyway, they said the correct plural. That is, they always, so for Clys, they said Clys. For Klish, they said Klishes. And for Plick, they said Plicks. Just like the way you're supposed to say by this rule number 3. Now, notice that they had not heard these names before. These names were given to right there, that's the first time they ever heard. And they had certainly never heard the plural of these words, but they knew how to do that. Now, the conclusion is, of course, that they knew the rule. But knowing the rule implies a little bit more than that. That is, they not only did they know the rule, they could apply it. And in order to apply the rule, of course, what they had to do is they had to slice the word up into the last phoneme and the rest, minimally. And then, once they had done that, then they could pick the right suffix, namely whatever it was for each of the 3 sets, just as is given in your rule number 3. Now, so the conclusion is that that children have knowledge of the kind that presupposes their ability to divide these continuous speech signal up into words and the words into phonemes and perform these rather complicated, perhaps not so complicated, but anyway, these tasks of making the plural. Now the next question that I will briefly discuss is what are phonemes? Now, when you study phonemes, I've given you a list of phonemes in 4. Now so p, b, f, v, m. Those are so pill, bill, fill, veil, mall, or something like that. These are and similar to the, and so on. Now, when we pronounce these, as you study these things, you notice something, that when you pronounce these phonemes, all the ones that I've given you involve complete closure, this closure of your mouth, so that the air is obstructed in its flow, in its outflow. That's very different, let's say, when you have other phonemes like, say, A or O or E. These are vowels are quite different from the consonants that I've given you, and they all have this the property that somehow there's an obstruction to the flow of air. Now, what differentiates the three groups is the piece of machinery that you have that obstructs the flow. So in the first set, p, b, f, m, and so on, it's the lips. In the second set, it's the flat part of the tongue. See, it's not the lips, but it's the flat part of the tongue. And in the third set, it's the body of the tongue that stops the airflow. So you have we have three groups, depending on the articulator is the technical term that interrupts the airflow. Now, so that's one property that there's the airflow is interrupted, and there's a particular articulator that does the interrupting, and that's what makes them different. Now, in the first line, it says nasal. Now, what you notice there is that we allow, in some sounds, the air to flow through the nose. We open up a side port, as it were, which allows the air to flow through the nose, and that excites certain resonances in these cavities here, and you have these sounds like the so-called nasal sounds. The rest of the sounds are produced in such a way that the soft palate is raised up and no air is allowed to flow through the nose. And so we have this, and you see what you're supposed to see here is that this is a particular gesture that is the same in all three types of sounds. So n and m are quite similar in that you have a lowering of this soft palate, but in one case you superimpose this on a labial stoppage of flow. In the other case, you impose it on a coronal stoppage of flow, and in the third case on a dorsal stoppage of flow. What you see here is that they have a sort of similar internal structure. Now, if you look at the non-nasal sounds, you notice two other things. You notice that sounds like p and t and f and th are produced without vocal cord vibration. Now, you can tell whether your vocal cords vibrate when you say zzz, they vibrate. And you can feel that when you say ss, they don't vibrate. So there's another property that this vocal cord vibration that goes in. And now you notice again, you can vibrate your vocal cords while stopping the airflow with your lips, or while stopping it with your flat part of the tongue or the tongue body, and you can do that in different ways. And finally, and that is represented by the minuses and pluses in the second line. And it says something happens at your glottis that you switch on and off, and either the vocal cords vibrate or they don't, and that's represented on line 2. Now, finally, the stoppage can be complete, as it is, let's say, in p or t, or it can be sort of partial, as it is in, let's say, f or s, where air is trapped inside your mouth, but only partially. Okay. Now, and the idea, what you notice here is that these are sort of sub-gestures. The closure, the lowering of the velum, the behavior of the vocal folds, all these, each of these is represented in three variants. In the first class, where the major closure is made with the lips. In the second class, where it's made with the flat part of the tongue. In the third part, where it's performed with the tongue body, by raising the tongue body. And now these subgestures you find in all, each phoneme therefore is sort of a complex of subgestures. And the technical term is to say that phonemes are complexes of features. Now, so that a speech sound is not something which is further unanalyzable, but rather it's a complex of subproperties. So now, and perhaps the most interesting observation to be made is, of all the sounds in the world, only phonemes are complexes of features, and only features can be analyzed into phonemes, and they must be analyzed into phonemes. So when you hear to ask, I mean, what does when you represent, let's say, a sound of a car or a rattle in your car, you don't have phonemes to represent that. I mean, some kind of rattle that, whereas words, they're divided into phonemes, and the phonemes are made up of features. That's sort of the idea. Okay. Now this digression, this technical digression, was necessary to bring out the next thing. Now, obviously, none of you, or most of you, who has never heard of phonemes before, and I'm here the first to tell you. Now, what's interesting is that we now may ask a question. Do people who know English, do they think about the phonemes in terms of indivisible units, or are English speakers in their naive behavior, is their behavior properly characterized in terms of features? And here is and we will try to show you how that works. Now, if the latter is true, then the knowledge that the people that knew the plural rule, that knew the rule number 3, then of course they wouldn't have lists of phonemes, they would have feature lists of some sort. That is, this knowledge would not be represented by a list of phonemes, but if phonemes are always feature bundles, then they would be represented by feature bundles. So for example, let's now look at 5, which is a translation of 3 into features. Now notice, the first set is the sounds s, je, s, z, ch, j. Now all these sounds are made with a flat part of the tongue. They are coronal. They have the coronal feature. And moreover, they have some other features which we won't bother now. Okay, so the translation of the list, that's list in 3a, is, as I've given in 5, saying it's coronal. Does it have the feature coronal plus some other features? Okay? Now the second list says p, t, k, f, s. Now those are all the sounds, and only that are made out without vibration of the vocal folds. They are unvoiced. And so the rule now has been translated into feature. I mean, 5 is just a translation into feature terms of that list that I've given you in 3. And now the question is, in which form do you, as a speaker of English, know the plural rule? Now the answer, and we will now run an experiment right away, and we will see whether it works. Okay, now the test was suggested to be many years ago by Lisa Min, who's now a professor at the University of Colorado. And what the test that she suggested was quite simple. First of all, she said, look, you can ask people to make plurals of non-English words. So, for example, if you knew a Frenchman whose name was Delarue, although U doesn't exist in English, you could ask what's the plural of Monsieur Delarue and his family, and somebody. So what is it? Which one? Which one? Which one? What? Which one? The first, the second, or the third? Third one. Okay, fine. Good. We're getting there. Now, however, let's have now the two lists make different predictions about this sound U. Number 3 says, regardless of what the sound is, if it's not an English sound, you have to make Z. That's what number 3 says. But number 5 doesn't say that. Number 5 says, look at its features. If it has the features, then apply the rule. Okay? So now we have to find a phoneme of English, which is not in English, but which has appropriate features, so that wouldn't pick number 3. And we do have that, and everybody knows Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, Bach, he had many children, and so and what's the plural of Bach? Number 2, not number 3. Okay? Now, and that's clear that everybody picks number 2 and not number 3. Although h is not a phoneme of English. Therefore, there couldn't be a list. It couldn't be listed in anything that's a rule of English. And therefore, since the action was performed here and the test was run here, it's clear that somehow or other people know something about features. Maybe they had never heard about it, but then, you know, a lot of things you haven't heard about that, you know, play a real role in life. Okay, so we have now established that phonemes are actually bundles of features, and that speakers have knowledge, in a very strong sense, of these features. They may not have any way of talking about it, but then we don't have any way of talking about how we walk. You know, we don't know how we balance ourselves so that we don't fall down. But we know how to do that, even though we can't talk about it. Okay. Now, so what we have, so these are features. I mean, that a phoneme is a bundle of features, and a word now, we can now say something about the way the word is represented in memory. Namely, it be represented by a matrix, where each column will represent a column of features, and there will be, you know, as many phonemes. Each phoneme will be a column of features, and there will be as many phonemes in the word as there are, as many columns as there are phonemes in the word. So that's now the claim that we're going to make about the representation of words in memory. Now we want to go on a little bit and say perhaps a little bit more. Now, notice that the features are, in one sense, they're instructions. They're instructions for actions. That is, in one case, say, lower your velum, or close your lips, or they're actions that are observable actions. Now, in memory, of course, these instructions serve to distinguish one word from another. So the difference between, let's say, the word bill and the word mill is that in mill, we have the instruction lower your velum, plus nasal, whereas in bill, it's minus nasal. Right? I mean, that's the instruction. But in memory, they serve as a kind of a purely a diacritic mark, which distinguishes one matrix from another. And only at some particular point does it eventuate an action. Now, interestingly, when you hear a signal, you therefore have to analyze this signal in terms of these actions in order to pick the word out of your memory, if the story is correct. I mean, the matrices are matrices in terms of actions of particular pieces of the machinery here. Now, you know, what this sort of presupposes or implies is that there is kind of a primacy of the gymnastics that's going on over the sound that's out there. That is, you analyze the sound in terms of the gymnastics in order to figure out which word did he say in order for me to understand that person whose speech I'm now understanding. Now, this may sound as rather surprising. Now, some researchers have questioned the need for the translation from acoustics into articulations. Articulations is gymnastics. And have proposed instead that features in memory are directly related to properties in the acoustic signal, rather than being indirectly related to properties in the acoustic signal. It is therefore necessary at this point to review the evidence that supports the alternative view, namely, for me, since I have proposed that, that the acoustic signal is not directly related to specific acoustic properties in the signal, but rather that this relationship is indirect, mediated. Now, this view, by the way, has a name in the literature, and it's called the motor theory, and it was been championed for a long time by Al Liberman of Haskins Laboratory and a number of other people that you may know. And now I will give a little bit of evidence to why it is indirect, why I think this is so, that there's a primacy of the articulation over the sound. And the first evidence is when you ask speakers of any language to say a word, so you make a nonsense word like soup, let's say. Just made up some word. And you ask somebody to say it without, even in the dark, so they can't see you. Or you play a record so they can't see what you do. And they say, please repeat this word. The actions that they perform will be enormously uniform. They may not 100% uniform, but the uniformity is enormously surprising. So when they hear that word, they will start by raising the flat part of the tongue up against the roof of the mouth, and they round their lips, and then they raise the body of the tongue. I mean, the actions are executed always the same. There'll never be an attempt, to mimic the sound by putting your fingers in your mouth or doing something desperate. It'll always be the uniform, and it's universal. I mean, there's no instruction, no teaching. That happens when you're such a request is made. So it's it's not only an English speaker, but you ask somebody who never heard English, and you tell them to pronounce this sound, and there will be an enormous uniformity. And the uniformity will be in terms of this execution of this particular action. Now, notice when you ask people to produce a sound, or you make you make some odd sound and say, well, see what you can do. And, like scratching two pieces of metal plates and reproduce this sound. And people will get very lost. They're very flustered. But, we have this built in. Certain sounds we analyze into articulatory gestures, namely features, and those we then produce. And then others, we do all kinds of wild things. Another bit of evidence is the so-called McGurk experiment, as some of you may know. Now, the McGurk experiment consisted of the following rather surprising test. I mean, people heard a tape and saw a video, shown a tape and a video where somebody says dead, 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 dead. At a particular point, the audio portion remains the same, but the video portion changes to somebody saying do, like this, saying do, 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 essentially. Although the audio portion continues saying dead, 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 and the impression that people have is that the person switched, and that he's now saying do, do, do. And you can actually, you turn off the video and they hear the dead, dead, dead again, and you turn the video up, and it's sort of an illusion. And the illusion simply shows you that articulatory information, once you receive this articulatory cue, I mean, it's so overwhelming that you think that you hear something different. So here's another bit of kind of evidence that suggests that. Now, the third is what happens in language, and this is my last point. I take about 10 minutes to make it. And that is that in addition to making plurals, there are other kind of rules in language. And I'll begin by one. And these rules, as you will see, always affect features. They always affect one or two features, as you will see in just a moment. So take, for example, the words in 6. Now notice, when we say, take a word like leaf. Now the plural of leaf happens not to be leaves, but it's leaves. You know, we say chief, chiefs, but leaf, leaves, okay? Now, the same thing, let's take house. The plural of house is not houses. That would be the plural of Herman's and his family. But it would be, it's houses. I mean, so what happens is that in the plural, we change the shape of the stem. The noun in the plural has a different sound than in the singular. So house in the plural, in the singular, but house in the plural. Now we don't do it that's not reflected in the spelling, but notice for F and V, we reflect that even in the spelling. So we say leaf, but the plural is leaves, and we write a different letter there to reflect that. But for house, we don't bother. We don't write Z there. Okay, there's a small number of English words which have this property. And in order to speak English correctly, you have to do that. If you said leaves, somebody would correct you. That's not correct. I mean, so there is this kind of a small rule. And we have a rule which I've written in number 7. And what the rule says is that if you have a sound such as plus continuant means fs, and it's that kind of sound, which has incomplete blockage of the flow, that this sound in the plural becomes voiced. It changes its features composition so that instead of being produced without vocal cord vibration, it's now produced with vocal cord vibration. So there is such, and that's part of knowing English. Okay, now, interestingly, there's other things that affect voicing in English. So let's take the suffix that's spelled th, which you find on the one hand in the ordinal numbers. So twelfths. In other words, 12, but twelfths. See? Now, or 5, and you say fifths. It's not v, 5, but fifth. So there's the v becomes f, which in feature terms means it becomes voiceless. And notice the same thing happens in the when the th is used to make a noun from an adjective. So we say wide, but we say width. D, but widths. See, or broad, and we say breadths. Okay, I mean, there are other such examples. All right? Now, what's interesting, is that here, again, we have, in terms of features, what we would say is that this consonant becomes minus voice before the suffix th. You know, this is I'll write it like this, the suffix th. But here, it's sort of wrong to put it that way. Because really what's going on here is not, this th is itself minus voice. You know, when we had this, I've written here without the feature composition. But th itself is a voiceless. Now what's going on here is that the feature minus voice is sort of spread onto the preceding sound. It's sort of being anticipated, as it were. See, it's not just any change that's going on here. It isn't as though, this consonant becomes nasal or some crazy change. The change here is really a change of a feature spreading from one phoneme onto the other. And what you have here is a kind of an anticipation of voicelessness. You know that this is going to be voiceless, so therefore you anticipated already. But now let's go back to the English plural rule. And notice what we had there was we said, well, we get, if it's minus voice, then it becomes s. Otherwise, it's z. Remember, that's what Rule 5 said, the last part. But again, what you have here, see, is a spreading in the opposite direction. That is, the spreading goes from the end of the stem onto the suffix. That is, the suffix was z, or is the basic suffix is z. But if it follows a voiceless consonant, then the voicing feature now is spread onto it. So here you have, like, as it were, a kind of a perseverance, an inertia effect, where this feature of the stem is held over onto the suffix. And I've represented these two things in your handout. One is in 10, and the other one is in 11. Where I try to show you that in one case we have kind of an anticipation effect, and in the other case we have a inertia effect. Okay, and now again, is that I want to go on and show you a very surprising, unexpected effect, and that is when we look at the actual gesture. It begins to make very good sense when we look at the actual gesture, which I'm going to now tell you. Okay. Now, how is voicing produced? I mean, we vibrate our vocal cords. How do we do that? Well, we don't, each vibration isn't individually controlled. They go much too fast. They go several hundred times a second, so it has to be done in some other way. And the way you do it is basically like so. I mean, it's a kind of a relaxation oscillation where you blow air up from the lungs. The vocal cords sit on top of the lungs. They're elastic. As the pressure builds up, the vocal cords are shoved apart. Then some air escapes. The pressure drops, the Bernoulli effect, vocal cords close, and the whole thing starts all over again from the beginning. So that's the actual action. Now, Ken Stevens and I, who like Pete Elias and I, go back to prehistoric times. We some 25 years ago we investigated the matter. We studied this whole question of how that works. And one of the things we noticed immediately, and for this we claim no credit, or we shouldn't claim any credit, is that what happens as you stiffen the vocal cords, what happens? Now, interesting, the first thing that happens is that the rate of vibration will increase. So as you make them stiffer, the rate of vibration increases. Now, we know that we control, what does the vocal cord vibration reflect? Well, when I increase my vocal cord, let's say when I say a vowel or any vowel, and I increase the rate of vibration of my vocal cord, the pitch goes up. Say, these are changes in the rate of vibration that are affected probably by changing the stiffness of the vocal cords. Now, however, and here's the more interesting fact. When you make a vowel sound, as I indicated before, your mouth is wide open, and no air is trapped in your mouth. And the pressure inside your mouth is roughly ambient pressure. And so the drop from what goes on from the lungs onto the, into the mouth is sort of the maximal pressure, the difference that can be. Now, what happens when you say, let's say, s, or s? Well, when you say s, you trap air in your mouth, and some pressure is built up inside your mouth, and therefore the drop across the vocal folds, assuming that the pressure in the lungs remains the same, is less. So we have two cases. In a sound like s, we have small pressure drop, and in the sound like ah, we have maximum pressure drop. And now the question we asked was, what happens as you make the same changes in vocal cord stiffness? What will be the behavior of the vocal cords? Now we know in the case of big pressure drop, there will be increase in the rate of vibration. But in the case of a little pressure drop, small pressure drop, what happens, not surprisingly when you think about it, is that as you increase the stiffness, the vocal cords stop vibrating. Because there's just not enough push at this point to show the stiffness is now so great that, and the pressure is so small that they simply don't vibrate. So that says that as a gesture, the differences in pitch, that is high pitch versus low pitch, and voicelessness, absence of vocal cord vibration, and presence of vocal cord vibration are produced by the same mechanism. Right? That is the same articulatory mechanism that is involved in making changes in pitch is present in making the difference, differentiating s from z, from v, and so on. Okay? Now, that's simply the logic of the situation. That seems to be the way it is. Now the question, but now notice what's interesting, and if you look in your handout on page 13, I've sort of made a table there. And I said a large pressure drop, and on the left I said stiff vocal folds and slack vocal folds. And it was a large pressure drop, higher rate of vibration versus lower rate of vibration. With small pressure drop, absence of vibration, cessation of vibration, presence of vibration. Okay? So, but now notice acoustically, and here's the question that we try to raise, what has primacy? Is it the gymnastics, or is it the sound? Okay, now notice the sound is very different. I mean, there's really nothing in common between a high-pitched vowel and a low-pitched, and a voiceless consonant, and a low-pitched vowel and a voiced consonant. Okay, so here is acoustically they should go their separate ways, but from the point of view of the mechanisms, they seem to be going the same way. Now, but we have even a little bit of linguistic evidence to show that perhaps that's the right way to go, and that is, and this evidence is given in your these examples from Chinese dialect in number 14. Now, what goes on there is, you know, in the Chinese words, in many of the in the Chinese languages, they are differentiated by the pitch contours that they have. So they have a falling contour, or a rising contour, or an even contour, and that makes differences in meaning. I mean, you know, everybody knows that. Okay, but now in this particular dialect, which is not the standard, I mean, which is not the Mandarin standard dialect or any of the, it's a particular Amoy dialect. Now what you see there is this, that look on the left-hand column. Now the numbers indicate pitches. So 5 is the highest pitch and 1 is the lowest. So 5-3 is a falling pitch, and 3-5 is a rising, and 4-4 is even. But now notice, you have these two sets of words, and they have falling, even, and rising. And they come in two versions. A high-pitched version, when the sound is t, and a low-pitched version, when the sound is d. So in the word T, they have three versions of the word T. And, it was right, T and T and T. And then they have the same with D. But the register in which it happens, so is a high register or a low register, if you will. And that goes, of course, with the voicing of the preceding of the consonant. If you have t, which is a voiceless consonant, that is one that you form by stiffening your vocal folds, you now spread this stiffening of the vocal fold onto the following vowel, and therefore the pitch of the vowel goes up. In the other case, you slacken the vocal, you have a d with slackening of the vocal folds, and as you spread that over to the vowel, and as a result, the pitch of the vowel drops. So in fact, there seems to be a rule in Chinese which said, spread that stiffening from the preceding consonant onto the following vowel, and that's it. So the rule is really just exactly like the rule that we have for the English plural, only in the English plural we spread it among consonants and leave the vowels alone, as it were, whereas in Chinese we spread from a consonant to the vowel, and the results are exactly as expected. But implicit in all this is that the gesture, the articulatory gymnastics, is the primary thing, whereas the acoustic result is, as it were, a secondary thing. So this brings me, I'll just have one brief conclusion. I'll say that I've argued that words are stored in memory as sequences of discrete phonemes. I've suggested that phonemes are composed of more elementary entities, namely features. I've attempted to give some idea of the nature of the features, and I've discussed a number of facts that suggest that a significant part of the knowledge that speakers have of their language involves features. I noted that because of its great complexity, it is implausible to assume that the machinery involved in the memorization and production of words is learned by speakers. Instead, it's more plausible to assume that much of the knowledge required for speaking is innate, hardwired in us at birth. And finally, I gave some evidence to show that the articulatory actions of the different features are of a more central character to the functioning of languages than their acoustic effects.
Thanks, Lars. Any questions? Yes.
If English is not your mother tongue, when does the hard wiring set in?
It's different for different people. I have a colleague, Ken Hale, for whom he's, I think, 55, and hardwiring has yet to begin. But for most people, it's around puberty. Puberty, about 12, 13.
How do deaf mutes that never learn a language? That must be very different then.
Well, notice that their natural language is, of course, the gesture. Now, you see, when we speak, your mom always tells you not to, but most of us do. And the deaf, you see, they develop a language which is every bit as complex as English. It's not English. I mean, deaf mutes do not just sign words. I mean, they sign English words in the order in which the English syntax puts them. They have a sign language which
Their memory must work very differently.
no, their memory is in terms of gestures. And they happen to have gestures of the upper body and the hands rather than gestures of the lips and those articulators that we use, those of us who can hear. And this clearly, and as you well know, that these children develop, for example, deaf children of parents who are not deaf. they learn sign, and they learn sign correctly, although the parents very often don't know how to sign correctly. Because a lot of it is really innate in them, and we have these both parallel channels, of which for obvious energetic reasons, the spoken chat, the one that we use for speaking, is to be preferred because you're moving much smaller masses. You know, when you move your arms and your body, I mean, you're really moving pounds, you know, whereas when you move this, you just move a few grams, you know, and therefore it's much more efficient from that point of view. So that's the preferred one. But sign languages have existed and exist, and they're just every bit as complicated as other languages. Louis?
The storing of a language involves many thousands of words and plurals and so on. And it's tempting, at least, to ask, is the memory in terms of all these words, which is very large, or is it in terms of features or whatever, and features and rules which can combine things to make the words? What's known about this, or what's speculated?
Well, what I showed you is that the representation would have to be in terms of some feature. I mean, we're extremely gifted, enormously gifted for memorizing enormous numbers of words. You know, the average child age 6 knows something like, I don't know, 30,000 words. And that's an enormous number, you know, when you think that the child, I mean, there's stages in children where they learn something like a word an hour, a new word an hour. Those of you who've taken language courses and had to memorize words will know what a horribly difficult task that is. And so we're very capable, I mean, naturally very gifted at memorizing thousands and thousands of words at a young age. And the rules of language, like those that I showed you, are very obviously in terms of features. A feature changes because you spread this feature onto some adjacent phoneme, as I tried to show you, or things like that. That's what goes on. Sir?
You make a good case for how we want to form plurals being a mechanical question or a gymnastic question. How do you explain roofs, and whose, or the fact that we'd use a different plural for the word loaf depending on its meaning?
Yeah. There are, as if you didn't get the handout, but in number 7 I said that, or number 6, I forget now what number it was. In number 7, I said that there's a list. I said, notice, applies only to leaf. There's about 30 words where this rule applies. And it's part of, you have to memorize. I mean, a large part of English is memorization.
So with the test with the dolls, and if the doll is named Toof, how will the child pluralize?
Child will probably do the go. Look, the child, notice, children will make mistakes. And the mistakes, so for example, you probably, if you've seen, children will say mouses. Now notice, they never heard mouses, or they will hear oxes. You know, they'll say oxes. They never heard oxes because the language around them doesn't use that. They've said, but so that, I mean, that goes again to show that they know the rule, and they've learned the rule, and they haven't learned the exception rule, namely that for ox you don't do it, you know. So they just go by the regular rule until somebody takes them aside and says, hey. Ma'am?
Yes, in section 8, in your item 8 in the list.
What?
In your item 8 in your handout, you talked about the voicing change of the last consonant.
Yeah.
The more striking thing there is the vowel change. Do you have an explanation for the vowel change?
Yes, I do, but that's a long story. I mean, I'll tell you see me privately, I'll tell you. But I mean, that's a long story. Yeah, it's a shortening thing. These are they're partly shortening and other things too. And but that's a lot. It would take me 10 minutes to do it, so it's not appropriate.
You didn't get a chance to talk about things like syllable structure or stress pattern. I assume that's because you would group it under your grammatical.
No.
Or
I only. This is lesson 1.
could you comment? Could you comment on the role of things like that in the representation of words in writing? Or is that a?
Yes, I can comment. I don't know. I think syllable structure and stress are. What I believe is this. That now I can't give you any evidence, needless for this for now, is that the representation, see, I've said that the representation is a form of a matrix, so each phoneme is sort of a block of features. That's what I said. Now, I think that a proper way to think about it is even somewhat different, namely that this block that there's a timing slot associated with each phoneme. And the blocks of features are associated with the timing slot. And so it's possible, for example, for a given phoneme to be associated with 2 timing slots. Like, for example, when you say, say coolly or something like this, cool plus ly. Or things like that, okay? Where the phoneme gets spread, a given phoneme gets spread over 2 slots. And things like, now, syllable structure, I think is imposed on these timing slots and is represented on a plane that's orthogonal to the plane in which the feature composition is. And stress is yet on another plane, which is orthogonal, so that the actual, if you want to have a physical picture, it's like the knowledge that you have of a word is like a spiral-bound notebook, which is all, the registration is all in terms of these timing slots. And there's various structures of the timing slots. And you can peek. I mean, you can look from one page to the other. These pages, and so you look at something here and decide what to do about the stress and so on. And they have vast, interesting specific properties. And the syllable structure is a particular kind, and I've written about this and so on. But that's kind of a short answer to a very long question. Here one.
There are sort of other experiments too. So you sort of argued that people represent these phoneme representations in sort of like motor control sort of program. Like not the acoustic. The acoustic signal isn't important per se. It's sort of more you try to map the acoustic signal into a motor program to recognize a phoneme.
Well, I said that there's something, that there's knowledge of language which is independent of speaking. Like, for example, it's conceivable that you could be, you would have, let's say, an injury, or somebody would have an injury. And that would not permit that person to speak. Some neurological injury would simply block any speaking. And the person would still know English perfectly well, couldn't perform the actions, but the actions would still be represented by the language acts, and so in terms of these features, and the features are related to actions, whether they can be carried out or not.
People have done experiments, right, where you like shoot Novocaine so that you can produce
Yeah,
things,
yeah.
or you add weights to people's
Yes,
arms or
right.
something. And after a couple of trials, they sort of adjust, right? So they're actually kind of using a different like motor sequence to produce the things.
Yes and no.
So
yes and no. Yes, to some extent, true. But also, they never make a T with their lips, or they never make a B with by manipulating the velum. See, they're enormous. I mean, there is some plasticity, but the plasticity is very limited. See, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is this plasticity, but the plasticity, as I say.
But it seems like that they do those adjustments based on sort of acoustic information.
Sure.
They try to produce.
But look, there's a real reason why deaf people don't speak. You know, I mean, it's the acoustics triggers it. I mean, so I said that, you know, I didn't mean to say that you don't have to listen. If you don't hear, you can't. It never works. But there's this very close tie-up between the acoustics and the articulation, and that's what I try to stress.
But internally, you claim that you think, or you said you believed that words were represented not so much as a sequence of features, but more as the sequence of actions.
No, but the features are actions.
I see. Okay.
The features are actions. They represent as features, and the features are actions which have acoustic consequences. All right, and I don't want. Not for a moment do I deny that.
Maybe we better stop here.
All right. Anyway.
Thanks very much.